In William Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, a Venetian merchant, Bassanio, squanders his estate trying to woo a wealthy heiress, Portia, from the fictional town of Belmont. Left penniless, he approaches his friend Antonio, asking to borrow 3,000 ducats. Antonio is cash poor at the moment, however, and so he has Bassanio borrow the 3,000 ducats from Shylock, a Jewish merchant, with Antonio as the loan's guarantor. Antonio has antagonized Shylock in the past through his anti-Semitism, and also through his practice of lending money without interest, which has forced Shylock to lower his own money-lending rates. For these reasons, Shylock is reluctant to do business with Bassanio, with Antonio as the guarantor, but in the end he agrees to lend the 3,000 ducats and to do so with zero interest, but only on the following condition. If Antonio cannot pay back the loan by a specific date, Shylock will claim a pound of flesh. When the time comes to repay the loan, Antonio's ships have been reported to be lost at sea, and he cannot repay the money. Shylock then demands to cut out a pound of Antonio's flesh, as per their contract. Meanwhile, Portia and Bassanio have married in Belmont, and they hear news of what is occurring in Venice. As Antonio prepares for Shylock's knife, Bassanio travels to Venice with money from Portia and offers to give Shylock 6,000 ducats, or double what he originally borrowed. Shylock, however, insists upon his pound of flesh. The case is brought before the Duke of Venice, who wants to save Antonio from Shylock's gruesome demand, but is not able to nullify their legal contract. Secretly, Portia has also traveled to Venice with her handmaid, Nerissa. The two women disguise themselves as men, Portia as a young male lawyer named Balthazar, and Nerissa as a law clerk. In Scene 1, Act 4 of the play, Portia makes the following famous speech in praise of mercy in the Duke of Venice's court. She says, "The quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed, it blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest, it becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway, it is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, an earthly power doth then show like as gods when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoke thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which, if thou follow, this strict court of Venice must needs give sentence gainst the merchant there." Shylock is not persuaded by this speech, and continues to demand justice unseasoned by mercy, that is, a pound of Antonio's flesh. Antonio is only saved from this fate when Portia makes another argument that Shylock has only been promised a pound of flesh and not a drop of blood. Therefore, should he shed a single drop of Antonio's blood in claiming his pound of flesh, he will have broken the law, and all of his lands and property will be forfeited under Venetian law. In the end, having declined the offer of 6,000 ducats, but unable to claim his pound of flesh, Shylock is left with nothing but humiliation. In The Need for More Than Justice, feminist philosopher Annette Beyer cites Portia's famous speech and the claim that justice should be seasoned by mercy, and she also cites the 18th century philosopher David Hume, who described justice as a cold, jealous virtue. Although Beyer stresses that no one is against justice, historically many people have recognized that justice needs to be tempered by a warmer virtue, such as mercy, care, love, or compassion. On this topic, the Bible says, "For judgment is merciless for the one who has shown no mercy, but mercy triumphs over judgment." That's James 2:13. And in Paradise Lost, John Milton writes of tempering justice with mercy. That's Book 10, line 77. This idea that justice needs to be tempered by mercy is precisely the intuition that is at the heart of a feminist school of moral philosophy that emerged in the 20th century, care ethics. Care ethics began with Carol Gilligan's book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. As a graduate student in psychology at Harvard University, Gilligan had worked with moral psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, who was well known for his theory of the stages of moral development. His study depended on asking children, teenagers, and adults what they would do in certain moral dilemmas, and more importantly, why they would do what they would do, and then analyzing their moral reasoning. According to Kohlberg, there are 6 stages of moral development. Each stage is superior to the ones before when it comes to responding to ethical dilemmas. Stages 1 and 2 occur in a pre-conventional phase, which is entirely concerned with consequences and is based in animal instincts. These stages are expected of animals and children, but can also characterize the moral reasoning of adolescents and adults. Stages 3 and 4 occur in a conventional phase, or after a person has absorbed the norms of society. People reach these stages in adolescence and adulthood. Finally, stages 5 and 6 occur in a post-conventional phase, or when a person is able to think beyond how they have been socialized. Some people never reach the 5th and 6th stages. At stage 1, you are just concerned with consequences, such as, will I be punished if I act in this way? The worse the punishment is for an action, the more bad it is seen to be. At stage 2, self-interest is involved. You ask, what's in it for me if I act this way? An action is good if it benefits you. At stage 3, you are concerned about the approval of society. If an action will get you social approval, it must be good, and if it gets you social disapprobation, it must be bad. At stage 4, you are concerned with following the laws and other rules. You don't just do so for approval, though. You do so because of some kind of belief that a law-abiding society is a good one, that society needs laws and law-abiding citizens to function. This is kind of like Hobbes's Leviathan or some versions of social contract theory. At stage 5, a person is willing to break the norms, rules, and laws of society and act in ways that are disapproved of, if this means acting according to their principles or convictions. We can think here, for example, of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who, in his letter from Birmingham jail, defended breaking the law or engaging in civil disobedience in his struggle for racial justice. He defended his actions as being dictated by a higher law than civil law, divine law, religious and political principles, or others would say, natural law. Finally, at stage 6, a person makes moral decisions based on abstract reasoning. At this stage, one acts according to universalizing moral principles. Kohlberg ascribed to the moral philosophy of the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, which is rationalistic and universalizing, entailing what Kant called categorical imperatives, such as do not lie and do not steal, to which no exceptions should ever be made. The 6th stage of moral reasoning is essentially Kantianism. Kohlberg also noted what appeared to be moral regression. Tracking participants over long periods, he found that some people who had reached levels 5 or 6 in young adulthood would go back down to level 4, for example. Significantly, Kohlberg observed that few participants and none of the female participants ever reached the 6th stage. More generally, girls and women stayed at lower stages of moral development than boys and men. For Kohlberg, this meant that girls and women were inferior to men and boys when it comes to moral reasoning, which is something that numerous moral philosophers have historically argued, including Aristotle and Lawrence Kohlberg's favorite philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Notably, these male philosophers concluded from this that women shouldn't be able to hold political office or vote. In her 1982 book, In a Different Voice, Carol Gilligan disagrees with her teacher. She argues that the moral reasoning that characterized the responses of female children was not inferior, but simply different. The girls, for example, eschewed making categorical claims such as one should never lie or one should never steal in order to attend to the contexts of the moral dilemmas and the relationships that were involved. In certain situations, for instance, to spare your loved one's feelings or to get them a life-saving medication, it might be justifiable to lie or steal. So female participants did not ever justify their decision in these moral dilemmas based on abstract moral principles, the way some of the men and boys did. They were more concerned with taking the particularities of situations into account, and particularly they were concerned about relationships. Gilligan also found that when she did her own interviews with women and girls and men and boys and asked them to define themselves and who they were, women and girls were much more likely to define themselves in terms of their relationships. Gilligan argued that the girls were weighing relationships, the particulars of a situation, and emotions such as care, compassion, and concern over the cold, jealous virtue of justice. This did not so much make them morally inferior to the boys as it made them different. They were speaking in a different voice, Gilligan argues, the voice of care ethics rather than justice ethics. Care ethics is sometimes described as difference feminism, in that it suggests that women are equal to but different from men. But is this difference innate or social for care ethicists? Carol Gilligan herself is not clear on this matter, and there have been a few essentialist feminist care ethicists, such as the education scholar Nell Noddings, who have taken up care ethics in biologistically essentializing ways, arguing that because females are the ones who give birth and nurse children, do most of the caretaking of children, they are naturally inclined towards virtues such as care. The care ethicist Sarah Reddick published a book called Maternal Thinking Towards a Politics of Peace that is also pretty essentialist, arguing that because they tend to be mothers, women are ethically different from men in ways that, if they had more political power, would result in a better, less war-torn world. The vast majority of care ethicists, however, have argued that it is differences in how girls and women are socialized that explain the different ways in which they reason about morality. Because girls and women are more socialized to be nurturing and are frequently in caretaking roles, they are socialized to approach ethical dilemmas through the language of care, rather than of abstract principles of justice. Very schematically, here are a series of terms that we can use to contrast a justice perspective with a care perspective. On the care ethics side, we have concrete, personal, partial, private, relational, feeling, compassionate, responsibilities, relationship, interdependence, connectedness. On the justice side, we have universal rather than concrete, impersonal rather than personal, impartial rather than partial, public rather than private, contractual rather than relational, think of social contract theory. We have reason rather than feeling. We have fairness rather than compassion. We have rights rather than responsibilities. We have individual rather than relationship. We have independence rather than interdependence, and we have autonomy rather than connectedness. Importantly, Kohlberg's studies have been critiqued because he relied for his study participants on people from the Harvard community where he worked. The people involved in his psychological studies were thus mostly Harvard students, faculty, and their children, and so were overwhelmingly white and middle to upper middle class Americans, and they were also mostly young people, given the demographics of a university. It's an Ivy League university as well, so this is a privileged segment of society. When additional studies in moral psychology have been done that have studied a wider demographic in terms of socioeconomic class, race, nationality, and also included more old people, it was found that care ethics does not just characterize women, but everyone other than young, socioeconomically privileged, white, able-bodied men. Even upper middle-class white men, when they get older, will move towards a care ethics perspective rather than a justice perspective. Why would that be? While it has been theorized early on that girls and women would voice a care ethics perspective because they were involved in caring relations and care labor, this is also true of many people who are working class and people of color. they are very likely to be in caring professions. And when people get older, they are likely to begin to need more care and thus to begin valuing it more. The reason why the only people who speak in the moral voice of stage 6, according to Kohlberg's way of understanding moral reasoning, is because they are the only people who are so privileged that they neither need to care for anyone nor experience themselves as being cared for, although, needless to say, they are the recipients of all kinds of care that they simply are not actively acknowledging. For instance, emotional labor, sexual labor, and the domestic labor that women, working class people, and people of color are doing for these young Harvard men is invisible to them. Whereas once they start to experience chronic illness or disability, the fact that they are receiving and dependent upon care becomes harder to ignore. Beyer refers to some midlife crisis that jolts such men into bifocal moral vision, or into seeing both justice and care. Besides becoming ill or disabled or elderly, a divorce could also do this, or a separation. When their wife leaves them, some privileged men come to realize just how much they were relying on emotional and sexual and domestic labor that they had previously not recognized. Feminist philosophers, including care ethicists and also disability studies scholars, have critiqued the focus on autonomy in male-dominated political philosophy as a myth of the privileged, since the ideal of autonomy in much political theory has in many ways meant a denial of the importance of relationships and a denial of the fact that we are all interdependent upon one another. Care ethics, feminist philosophy more generally, and critical disability studies have recognized that the human condition, and indeed the animal condition, is vulnerability and interdependence. Feminist philosophers have replaced the ideal of outright autonomy with what they have called relational autonomy. We in fact depend on relationships with one another in order to be autonomous. A child is not born autonomous, but must be raised and taught the skills to live autonomously. So autonomy depends on other people and on relationships. And throughout our lives, we depend on others to maintain our autonomy. A disabled person, for instance, or an elderly person might rely on caregivers to be able to live autonomously in her own apartment rather than in a medical facility. And the privileged white male Harvard student who participated in Kohlberg's study and considers himself autonomous is in fact relying on a great number of people for various kinds of labor that are necessary to maintain his supposedly autonomous lifestyle. It has also been argued that when you are from a marginalized population, you rely on community more, and relationships are more valued and more visible. While the white American capitalist culture that was prevalently represented in Kohlberg's study puts a high value on autonomy, independence, and individual rights, other cultures put more value on community, family, and responsibilities and duties that a person has to their family and community. So in sum, Kohlberg's stage 6 only represented people like himself, white, upper middle class, able-bodied, and still relatively young American men, or a very small percentage of the demographic. Care ethics is thus not actually women's moral voice, but the voice of most people. In Annette Beyer's article, The Need for More Than Justice, she shifts from the auditory metaphor of different voices that Gilligan used to a visual metaphor. Justice is said to be blind. Think of those statues of justice as a woman with a blindfold holding scales. But Beyer suggests that she is not so much blind as she is one-eyed, and we need bifocal vision. We need to see the world through both the lenses of justice and care. On the justice model, what is most important is treating one another with respect, that is, respecting each other's autonomy and freedom, respecting each other's rights, not interfering with each other's individual pursuits, and so forth. But what Beyer argues is that we could have this and still be miserable, suicidal, and find life meaningless. With perfect justice, we might be equal and free, but lonely and depressed, because there has been no mention of friendship or care or love And we need those as much as we need autonomy and equality in order to flourish and find meaning in life. Like many care ethicists, Beyer takes the example of children to make this point, whereas the male philosophers virtually never talk about children, and they always tend to assume solitary, adult, and arguably male subjects. Beyer argues that there might be some space to talk about justice, equality, fairness, impartiality, and freedom, the types of aspirations when we are thinking about the needs of children. For example, arguably parents should not have a favorite child and should treat their children equally. That's justice. But children need more than that from parents, and arguably parents should be partial towards their own children in comparison to other people's children. Relations of love and care tend to entail treating people unequally. We remember our loved ones' birthdays and our friends' birthdays, but not everyone's birthdays. If we lived in a world where all relationships were just, in the sense of impartial and fair and equal, there might not be any love or friendship or family, other than in a biological sense, since love, friendship, and family all entail some level of partiality. There are situations in which impartiality is important. We hope that teachers are impartial when they are grading students, and that judges are impartial when they are making legal decisions. But justice in this sense, on its own, is not enough for human flourishing. We also need relationships, community, family, friends, love, relations of care. When confronted with these kinds of arguments, John Rawls responded to the feminist philosophers by acknowledging that care is very nice, and yes, it is arguably even important, but he insisted that it is still less important than justice. Justice is the first virtue, he said, of political institutions, and it is necessary for a minimal ethics, whereas care is an optional extra, a bonus, for a more expansive ethics. That is, we all need to be just for Rawls, but we aren't obliged to be caring. A teacher must treat her students fairly and impartially. A judge must be impartial, but whether they care about their students or the plaintiffs they see is not necessary. Being uncaring is not a fireable offense for a teacher the way that partiality in grading would be. Beyer's response to Rawls is that when we make care an optional virtue, it devalues care labor beneath the labor of justice, and then care will continue to be relegated to women and other subordinated groups, such as poor people and people of color. These are the people who do the care labor of society, and they receive little care. When care work is women's work, it is poorly paid or unpaid labor, and it is unreciprocated. Think about what a stay-at-home mom or a nurse gets paid compared to a lawyer or a judge. That is a reflection of how we value the work of care versus the work of justice. Currently, care is a virtue of the oppressed, but it does not need to be so, not if everyone was caring. Beyer thus argues that it is in fact unjust, unfair, unequal when we don't require and value care equally with justice, and when we don't equally distribute care labor throughout society or require it of men in particular. Care labor and the receiving of care must be equally distributed between genders and across society if we are to have justice, Beyer argues. Not valuing care actually results in injustice, and so she argues that justice and care are equally necessary and equally important, and they're interconnected. As Beyer notes, care ethics challenges the rationalism of Western philosophy, or the idea that reason is superior to emotions, the uplifting of reason above emotions, and the opposing of the two goes all the way back to Plato, who, in the Phaedrus, imagined the soul as a charioteer driving two horses, a black one and a white one. The charioteer is reason, and he is attempting to tame the unruly horses of appetite, the black horse, the especially bad one, and desire. Justice is understood as a rationalistic virtue in the history of philosophy, whereas care ethics clearly values emotions and embodied interpersonal relationships. Feminist philosophers have developed the field of affect theory and the philosophy of emotions, whereas male-dominated philosophy has been far more invested in the study of logic and rationalism. We can question, however, whether justice ever was about reason and whether reason and emotions are actually opposed. After all, we have seen that justice has very often meant revenge and retribution. Think back to Shylock, which surely is something in which humans are often emotionally invested, even when it is not rationally desirable and has poor consequences for ourselves and for society. Meanwhile, as Bayer argues, affective relationships are necessary to human flourishing. And so, surely, even from a rationalistic perspective, these are to be desired. They're rationally desirable and should be part of our political theories. Often our emotions are very reasonable, and not having certain emotions would be unreasonable. Emotions are a form of intelligence, and not the opposite of an intelligence that has been reduced to rationality in the philosophical tradition.